Welcome to a course in proposal writing. Let's begin with taking a look at what we mean by the underpinning of proposal writing, and that is the idea of literacy itself. In America, of course, literacy holds a privileged place. For many, literacy is vocational. The ability to read and write is a way to survive in the marketplace. But for others, literacy is a means to individual freedom. Through literacy, citizens find their own unique voice in the clamor of modern society. We believe that these two views of literacy, let's call them professional and liberal, should be complementary. And so it is that you'll best understand how to approach a course in proposal writing if you understand to begin with your own views toward literacy. In this first lecture, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about my own experiences in proposal writing, and talk to you a little bit about my own background with funding agencies as a way of providing a course introduction as an explanation of the way that I've structured the course the way I have. Think about your own experiences. Proposal writing should link to those. Think about your attitudes toward writing. What were your early experiences? What were your formative experiences? And what are your mature experiences now as a writer that you're taking the course? I want to give you some sense of my own experiences as we move through this lecture. My background was to take the doctorate in literature. And in the early years, there was enormous tension during the early 80s between composition studies and literature. Literature was seen as something that was aesthetic, something that was not especially applied, and composition studies were exactly the other, seen as a helping profession, and very related to the world of technical and professional writing. I began to teach early courses in technical writing while as a graduate student, and after graduation continued on not only my work in the academy, but in the world I had come to know, the world of the corporation. These are some of the corporations I've worked with over the years. During the early 80s, I had the opportunity to work at RCA American Communication. In those days, satellite communication was all the rage. Now it's a fact of life. This position gave me a better idea of what we might call emerging technologies now. At the New Jersey Department of Transportation, I got an idea of civil engineering and the context in which very complex engineering situations interact with social situations. United Jersey banks no longer exist. It's now been merged time and time again. But these experiences gave me insight into the world of finance, especially, though, into the world of merger and into the world of contingency and literacy's place in contingency. During the mid-'80s, I worked with Lone Star Gas Company in Dallas and Fort Worth, and had an idea again about natural energy, about ecology, and about what would become to be another interest over time, environmental studies. Becton Dickinson and Company involved some present work, particularly my own work and interest with public health and ways to develop appropriate technologies for healthcare. Funding sources over the years have also included publishers. Harcourt Brace, Holt Rinehart and Winston provided me opportunity to influence education, particularly in works that involve K through 12 students as well as college students. I've also had success with locally based agencies, specifically state funding. Work I'm involved in now helps us to understand an economic model of long-term AIDS care in a residential setting for people who are plagued with a chronic disease and who also, unfortunately, don't have the resources, the economic resources, to sustain themselves. Other work involved ethics and values in the engineering curriculum to try to find ways to merge humanistic interests with scientific interests. Other agencies I've worked with over the years include the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Science Foundation, and the National Park Service. My EPA work dealt mainly with the 1990 Pollution Prevention Act, an act that tried to stress design for environment issues and trying to find ways to integrate that paradigm shift into an engineering curriculum. Work with the National Science Foundation, continue that in trying to bring the humanities and social sciences into greater alignment with the needs and desires of engineering students. And work with the National Park Service helped me learn more about the craft of preservation and how we might be able to design a high school curriculum to allow students to learn that craft. Each of these agencies allowed me to develop my own research interests in public health, in ethics, and literacy, and education. And so it is that over the years, I began to see myself as a writer and a teacher, not solely as a researcher, but that a researcher would have had to have focused on one of the areas, public health, ethics, literacy, education, as opposed to range freely among them. Work as a writer and a teacher has provided more liberation, and so it is that I encourage you as well to see yourself during this course as a writer of proposals. This view will allow you to diversify your own interests more than if you view yourself as a narrow, discipline-oriented professional. What are the lessons learned over the past decade or so with funding? To begin with, a colleague once told me that I could talk a dog off of a meat wagon. I know that wasn't intended as a compliment, but nevertheless, it did give me an idea that facility with language, the ability to write lucidly and speak convincingly, is important in the proposal writing process. Regarding the capitalistic impulse, I'll recall for you the traditional definition of mainstream economics, the allocation of resources under conditions of scarcity. The capitalistic impulse over the years has worked very, very well for me in that it has allowed me to better understand, to have more experience with how resources may be distributed and how they might be well used, especially under conditions of scarcity not only of resources, but also of time. Over the past 10 or so years, my calculations tell me that I've come to more or less $2.5 million in grants. What has it bought? Well, certainly it's allowed me to advance my research and to work with colleagues in settings I wouldn't have dreamt possible. But it's also allowed me to transform lives, not only my own, but the lives of others. With some of the funds that have been bought, we've been able to look at curriculum, we've been able to look at regulations for AIDS patients, we've been able, I think, to do some good. And what were the good times and the bad times? I'm convinced that we learn not from things that go well, but from our mistakes. And throughout these lectures, I'll try to give you an idea very personally of those things that have gone well as those things that have gone awry, in the hopes, of course, that you'll be able to avoid the mistakes that I've made. What were the secondary gains? As someone who works in a university, there were publications, there were presentations, there were courses that I've gotten to taught. But as well, there were colleagues, people who I've gotten to work with in very, very diverse settings. And that's truly, truly helped me to understand more about the context in which literacy develops and emerges. And of course, finally, I think we have ethical responsibility in this work. We do take money from people. We do say we're going to do certain things with that money. I think we're bound to do those things. I think we're bound to do them well. So time and again, I'll talk in these lectures about the importance of responsibility towards our funders, towards ourselves, and toward the people with whom we will come in contact. And so according to these lectures. The lecture on funding talks about the nature of philanthropy from foundations, corporations, the government, and individual patrons. And I'll talk to you about a method for working up your sources of funding. The lecture on rhetoric is not meant to be overly academic, but I truly believe, unless you know something about the history of rhetoric and theories of rhetoric, that you get yourself in a terrible disadvantage when trying to compete for proposals. And so we'll talk about the psychodynamics of orality and literacy, and we'll take a brief romp through classical medieval rhetoric, rhetoric of the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, and where we are now in the 20th and the 21st century. We'll also talk a bit about our uses of theory. The lecture on audience analysis will give us a number of models by which we can look at our audiences and try to judge their knowledge, their beliefs, and their attitudes. We'll also talk about some false assumptions of our audiences and what is true about our relationship to those who will read our work. I've designed a proposal writing process that's rather complex, but I think it'll give you an idea of how you might begin to work through the different parts of the proposal. So there's a brief discussion in the proposal writing process on the anatomy of a proposal, but the following lecture takes you in detail through how you might execute the different parts of a proposal based on the material in the previous lecture of process, and will follow a model of invention, arrangement, and style, a classically oriented model that we'll have discovered first in our lecture on rhetoric and the tradition. What about persuasion? Is, as Andrea Lunsford says in her book, Everything in Argument, I think in this case it is. And we'll talk about the aims of persuasion, some fallacies of persuasion, and some systems of persuasion as well. We'll provide a checklist for effective persuasion. Think of cohesion as glue. We want to talk here in the lecture on cohesion about how to achieve document unity. We'll look at the goals of cohesion, and we'll look at some strategies for creating cohesion in documents. The lecture on the visual display of information will follow the work of Tufte. We'll talk about data graphics and provide some guidelines and some things to remember when combining visual explanations with print. Oral presentations are important in any context, but they're especially important in the proposal process during a pre-proposal, a procurement, or a contract stage. We'll talk about some lessons again from psychodynamics, and we'll provide here again some criteria for the use of presentations, specifically how presentations apply to the proposal process. We'll talk about what happens after the award comes in and how to achieve post-proposal success. We'll talk about working with the funder, everything from when we first get the grant all the way to closing out the grant and its success at the end, as well as planning for further work with the funder. In our final lecture, we'll take stock of what we've learned here. We'll try again to link what you've learned in the course to your experiences, and we'll try again in ending the course to talk about again our ethical responsibilities when we do this work, when we come into contact with others, and when we write, complete, and gain funding for our work.